Good morning and welcome to the Global Current. I'm Karina Taylor.
And I'm Chris Coleman.
In news, the Pope's visit to Africa.
And the current fight against the Islamic State.
In analysis, a spy exchange between China and Taiwan.
And child laborers farming cocoa in Côte d'Ivoire.
Then the Global Current interviews Dr. Catherine Tinker about the impact of the Paris Climate Summit.
Thanks for tuning in and enjoy the show. And now, Morgan Mount reports on Pope Francis's recent trip through the African continent.
In September, the Vatican announced Pope Francis's plan to visit 3 African nations during his 6-day visit to the continent. This past week, the Pope completed his trip. He visited Kenya, Uganda, and the Central African Republic from November 25th to the 30th, continuing a tradition of visiting developing countries. The Pope addressed the region's most demanding problems: corruption, war, and poverty.
Como en todas las cosas, hay que empezar.
As in everything, you have to make a start.
Si no querés corrupción
If you don't want
en tu
corruption,
corazón, en tu vida, en tu patria, empezá vos.
if you don't want corruption in your lives, in your hearts, and in your country, start now yourselves.
Si no empezás vos, tampoco va a empezar el vecino.
Because if you don't start, then the person who's beside you won't start.
The trip was completed despite security concerns. According to Reuters, the Pope first visited the capital of Kenya, Nairobi, where he visited Kanjami, a slum that houses over 500,000 people. He then held an interreligious meeting and celebrated Mass at the University of Nairobi. Initial planning of the Kenya visit was wrought with concern over the nation's recent outbreaks of violence. In September 2013, a 4-day siege in Nairobi's Westgate shopping mall left 67 dead. Last April, an attack by militants at the Garissa University College in eastern Kenya killed 148 people, most of them Christian. After Kenya, the Pope visited a home for the disabled in Nalukolongo, Uganda. The Pope's final stop was Bangui, the capital of the Central African Republic, where he addressed the intense violence between the Muslim and Christian communities. Much of the violence in the city is attributed to a largely Christian militia known as Anti-Balaka and a Muslim group called the Salika. Violence in Bangui swelled after the murder of a Muslim man. Thousands have died and hundreds of thousands have been displaced in the Central African Republic. Despite the numerous security concerns, the Pope completed his trip to Africa unharmed. According to NPR, throughout the trip, Pope Francis addressed pressing issues. He condemned corruption in Kenya, calling poverty in Kenya a new form of colonization. He also emphasized the importance of clean water and honored the 45 Anglican and Catholic martyrs who died from religious persecution in Uganda between 1885 and 1887. Most notably, he encouraged the Central African Republic's Christian and Muslim factions to make peace, calling on Muslims and Christians to act as brothers and sisters. This is Morgan Mount for the Global Current.
Joshua Siegel describes the current status of the battle against Islamic State.
Despite the tragedy of the attacks in Paris and ISIS's seemingly growing capacity to inflict harm outside its borders, it remains a nation under siege. The self-declared caliphate remains besieged by multiple factions across its vast territories. The most controversial of these campaigns remains Russia's continued support of the Syrian army with sustained and consistent airstrikes. Since the onset of Russia's campaign, the once demoralized Syrian army has experienced renewed and revitalized success. According to Reuters, on November 10th, Kuwari's air base in Aleppo was liberated after nearly a 2-year siege. The end of the siege is expected to amplify Russia's capacity to conduct airstrikes. Slate reports that the Syrian army's recent success against ISIS militants have culminated in the capture of Kaskas, Akula, and territory near Homs. Consequently, the Kurdish campaign against ISIS in Iraq and Syria continues to make substantial gains. The Kurdish militia, operating in conjunction with American airstrikes, has gradually reduced ISIS territory and consolidated administrative control over the newly acquired land. According to the New York Times, the Kurds have managed to secure roughly 11,000 square miles, an expanse roughly the size of Maryland. This campaign has not been without its geopolitical complications. Assistance from the Kurdish Workers' Party, or PKK, has amplified tensions with Turkey, which regards the PKK as a terrorist organization. In Iraq, Kurdish Peshmerga fighters and Yazidis captured the vital town of Sinjar, effectively dividing ISIS in Iraq and Syria.
Peshmerga forces are patrolling each and every alley of the town, and they're repelling the militants. We have seized many of their weapons, and we have also bodies of dead militants.
يعني فترة مسيطرة.
In Iraq, a coalition led by the United States has provided the Iraqi army with the necessary momentum to surround Ramadi. The Iraqi army has begun planning an offensive according to U.S. News and World Report. In addition, several oil refineries, such as the Baji oil refinery, have been retaken by coalition forces, depriving the Islamic State of a key source of revenue. Slate reports that ISIS has lost between 15 and 25% of its territory as a result of coalition operations in Iraq and Syria. Defense Secretary Ashton Carter just recently announced the creation of a special forces unit soon to be inserted in both Iraq and Syria to perform vital combat functions. While the campaign is far from over, the momentum has shifted against the Islamic State. This is Joshua Siegel for the Global Current.
Vaughn Rogers examines the implications of a spy exchange between Taiwan and China.
Before the historic meeting between Chinese President Xi Jinping and Taiwanese President Ma Ying-jeou to improve relations, a prisoner exchange occurred, reports the BBC. The exchange was of spies, 2 Taiwanese, 1 Chinese, serving terms of 9 and 16 years respectively for spying on the other countries. The Taiwanese spies Chu Keng-shun and Xu Changguo, the same article states, were colonels captured by the Chinese and the last military officials imprisoned for spying. A spokesman for the mainland's military defense, Luo Shuohe, denied that this was a spy swap.
This is absolutely not a spy swap. These 2 have been imprisoned by China's Communist Party for 9 years before their release was granted, and now they are free to return to Taiwan.
In light of the 60-year gap in relations between Taiwan and China, this is a positive step to improving relations, or so many reports say. China still claims Taiwan as part of the country and has insisted on this one China policy in its relations with other government bodies, including the UN. Many countries who seek better economic and social ties with China must also agree to this policy. But on the other hand, Taiwan only came under control of China during the Qing dynasty when Taiwan was annexed in 1683. Before that, the island had been governed by several different indigenous kingdoms and Chinese, English, and Dutch settlers. The mainland hasn't controlled Taiwan since 1895, when China ceded Taiwan to Japan amidst the First Sino-Japanese War. The Taiwanese today continue to assert their independence from China, especially considering China's growing power. Despite the appreciation for the release of the prisoners, many Taiwanese also claim that civilians are still being held in China and held unlawfully. Some argue that now that relations are expected to improve, there are more opportunities to exchange spies when that option before was impossible. Li Tianduo, a retired National Security Bureau officer, spoke to Formosa English News, saying,
Before cross-strait relations improved, there was no way to negotiate anything related to spies. In the beginning, there was no way to address these issues, and we didn't know how to rescue them.
Although the people of Taiwan protest the thawing relationship, the Taiwanese government is continuing to converse with the mainland. This begs the question if the Taiwanese government will consider rejoining China or keep its independence and remain on frosty terms. Since Taiwan and China have had little to do with one another in the last 2 centuries, it is more likely that Taiwan will still fight for independence. But China's increasing power in the region makes many Taiwanese fear for its preservation. This is Vaughn Rogers reporting for the Global Current.
Connor Breza analyzes the use of child labor for cocoa farming in Côte d'Ivoire.
In the United States, 2 candy companies reign supreme. Together, Hershey and Mars comprise 65% of the U.S. confectionery market, with no other company holding more than a 5% stake. This industry is only set to grow over the next decade, achieving 15% growth over the next 5 years, according to Euromonitor International. Given the apparent demand for confectionaries, more specifically chocolate, as well as America's sweet tooth, it is no surprise that such an industry would thrive and flourish. However, these 2 companies, as well as many other firms in the industry, are profiting off the backs of child laborers. While the industry grows, naturally so does the rate of child labor. According to a survey done by Tulane University on child labor in the West African cocoa sector, between 2008 and 2014 there was an increase of over 20% in child labor in Côte d'Ivoire, with over 2 million children working in various agricultural positions. Further, the vast majority of these children are working in hazardous working conditions, not fit for even adults much of the time. According to a UNICEF report, 35% of these children are victims of trafficking, with only 5% of children in the Ivory Coast receiving wages for their work. The United States Department of Labor provides a list of responsibilities required to fulfill the roles many of these children in Côte d'Ivoire must undertake. These children must cut and burn down trees by themselves, spray poisonous pesticides on the crop, as well as harvest and transport the cocoa pods. In order to water the trees and crops, the children must carry heavy containers of water back and forth for extended periods of time. All of these actions carry with them a considerable amount of danger. Not only that, these children are being robbed of their chance at a childhood. Although this is a known problem in the industry, it is quite difficult to tackle, as such labor is sporadic in the supply and production chain in the region, and drastic changes in oversight would need to be implemented. Even the companies that are massive contributors to child labor in the supply chain have begun to implement measures to curb the use of children, as well as improve working conditions for those still employed. The Nestle Cocoa Plan is a program funded by Nestle in partnership with the Fair Labor Association. It aims to eliminate the use of children in their cocoa plantations, as well as fund schools in the region to educate the local youth instead. Sadly, this plan only covers 25% of their supply of cocoa, reports Confectionery News. Fortunately, they are not the only organization pledging to make changes. The International Cocoa Initiative is another organization pledging to bring awareness and support to the children and their cause. The numbers show that not only is the popularity of cocoa not decreasing, it has only risen over the past 5 years. This correlates with an ever greater increase in the profits of the big confectionery companies, as well as an increase in the amount of hours worked by children. In order to combat this trend, there needs to be more pressure placed on the big chocolate producers such as Hershey, Mars, and Nestle, as well as concrete action taken to remove any incentive to continue to use illegal labor. If the various class action lawsuits filed against these companies aren't enough to bring change, it is clear that widespread action on the part of consumers will be necessary to bring an end to a system that exploits millions of children a year for their labor. Reading for Connor Breza, this is Bill Golba on the Global Current.
Finally, the Global Current sits down with Dr. Catherine Tinker to discuss the possible outcomes of this year's International Climate Summit in Paris.
So my first question is, there's been a lot of climate talks in the past, so what makes this one different from all the other climate talks?
Okay. Actually, there's been a lot of talk since the 90s, because the actual treaty itself is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And that was signed in 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit Conference already, and entered into force 2 years later in 1994. Plus, that treaty has had a protocol adopted by some states. They're called the Kyoto Protocol. So a lot of your listeners will have heard of those two documents. What's going on in Paris is actually a conference of the parties to that basic treaty from the 90s and the 2005 Kyoto Protocol. Just to give you the background on that, because what the COP21 in Paris right now is trying to do is advance, build on those basic documents, the treaty and its protocol, to create a new international agreement about specific cuts in carbon emissions by all states around the world.
Okay, so would you say the main goal is to make more specific restrictions for past treaties?
Let me phrase it a little bit differently. These are states who are party to the treaty, and all treaties have subsequent meetings through the years called conferences of the parties. So this is just one of those, but it's a really important one because the attempt is to get a new agreement where each state says, I'm going to cut greenhouse gas emissions in my nation by X amount by 2020 or 2030. Very clear, very firm, very strong commitment to a specific target.
Is this just about cutting carbon emissions and greenhouse gases, or are there other environmental issues that they're discussing?
Well, this is the main one. This is absolutely the main one. But to make that happen, to make it work, there's another really important issue being discussed in Paris, which is financing. Who's going to pay for this? Who's going to help developing nations, poorer countries, to build their capacity so that they can achieve these cuts?
That's actually one of my other questions. So what are they doing to help developing countries?
Well, there is a fund. There's always been overseas development assistance, aid to developing countries. But this is a specific a green climate fund. And countries like the United States and European states and Australia are contributing to this. The developing countries, in part, are complaining that it's not enough and more needs to be given. The other issue, frankly, is one of the underlying stresses of the concept of sustainable development, because poorer states that are just beginning to industrialize, that are just beginning to provide consumer products like refrigerators and electricity to their citizens, are saying to the developed world, to the rich countries, you did all of that. You did all of that for your people at whatever cost to the environment. And that's why we have a crisis now with global warming. Poorer states are saying, it's our turn, and we may need to go through a period of environmentally harmful activities just to bring prosperity to our people. And then we'll do what you're doing now after we improve living conditions for our people. So what the real story in Paris is, how will that balance be struck? Can there be incentives to the most vulnerable, to poorer states, to jump over that period of dirty energy, of fossil fuel dependence, and go to clean energy and go straight to these cuts on greenhouse gas emissions worldwide that we need for the planet to survive?
Yeah, so speaking of clean energy, are there any new alternative clean energies that are being discussed at this conference, or any new technologies being introduced?
Well, there's discussion that there needs to be more research to find new technological solutions, but there are plenty of them out there that aren't being used fully. So much of the talk is about how do we get states to officially shift away from coal, away from petroleum, to solar power, to wind power, to nuclear energy, to these clean alternative energy sources that have already been developed and used, but maybe are not quite economically as attractive because enough places are not using them officially. The thrust of this, use what we already know about, it works, and get everybody to do it, the cost will come down, it will be even more efficient. So governments need to do it on that level of energy efficiency, and then individuals, all of us, all over the world, have to change our patterns of consumption. So we don't waste water, we don't waste food, we don't waste energy. We take personal responsibility as well as insisting that our governments take responsibility.
So for developing countries, is there a more viable clean energy option above all the options out there? Like, is nuclear energy or wind energy or solar energy the best for developing countries?
Absolutely, because otherwise if they're importing oil, they're paying somebody else money. And it depends on, each individual state, and this is what's so interesting, because we're talking about an international agreement, a universal agreement. The treaty itself, the climate change treaty, has been ratified or acceded to by almost all states. There are 196 countries of the world that are party to the climate change treaty itself. So this is a universal agreement. But in Paris, we're saying, no, let's look at what each nation has the capacity to promise to do, and then monitor that they're actually doing it. And if they're having a problem, let's see what it is and get technical assistance from other countries, get financing if that's the problem, whatever it is, so that the whole world can cooperate. Because problem for the whole world. No one country can solve this alone.
And so China is the number one emitter of greenhouse gases. Does it seem more prepared this time around going into this conference to actually bring down its emissions?
Well, there's at least the potential, because there was a groundbreaking pledge made by China last fall when the leader of the People's Republic of China met with President Obama. And for the first time, China made a pledge to reduce carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions generally. But China said, we need more time because we're just catching up to the developed world. So their pledge was not by 2020, like the other countries are doing. China said by 2030. But the significance of it is that they did make the pledge. So this is really the impetus The planners, the organizers for this Paris conference, put this out several years ago, asking states to make these national pledges before they got to Paris. And that's why people are optimistic that something really can come out of this conference, even when earlier meetings may have failed.
Okay. So for the United States going into this, what's going to be their biggest challenge, and what changes are they going to be required to make?
Okay. Well, anyone who's interested can go online on YouTube and listen to President Obama's speech in Paris at this conference. And I think the challenge will be how much can we really contribute in the financing, because we have our own economic challenges at home. But there is a pledge that was made several years ago, and President Obama said we are going to fulfill our part of this, that worldwide the OECD developed countries have pledged $100 billion to this Green Climate Fund by 2020. So that's going to be one mark we have to live up to. The other important pledge by the United States was to have our own national climate change plan, which has also been announced by the White House. And this is to wean ourselves away from dependence on dirty energy like coal, and to make it a national priority to use alternative energy sources around the whole United States. And that can be done. And we have pledged now to cut our emissions by 27 to 29%
Wow.
from previous levels in 2005. And so I think here the United States is really a leadership position, because earlier had been a pledge to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 17%. That was made back in 2009, I believe it was, at the Copenhagen conference. Now, the president has made this bigger commitment to cut our emissions by 27 to 29% by 2020. So this is really significant. And the European Union has stepped up to the plate also, with pledges between 30 and 40% reductions in greenhouse gas emissions are typical of the pledges that are being made by states.
So who are some other leaders that are in this conference, and what are they doing that could be an example to other nations?
Canada, the European Union, Australia have all taken strong leadership roles. India is an important player, and we're waiting to see how far India can go on this. And China's support. China has been in this breakthrough pledge, even if they pushed off the date for compliance to 2030, is a really important move for the rest of the developing world. And I just want to give credit to these small island developing states, because they've organized and created attention on the issues of their vulnerability to some of the effects of climate change through global warming, because they are small island developing states who will be gone with sea level rise. And it's already starting to happen in the South Pacific. That will mean perhaps even the loss of their countries, as people will have to leave, as their countries will disappear. The territories of these small islands will be covered by the ocean.
Wow.
And this is starting to happen now already. So they've brought this issue to the front of the discussions, and it's really been one of the issues that must be addressed.
Are there any talks going on about ocean? Because it seems like most of it has been about air. Is there anything about water pollution?
That's an excellent question. Absolutely. When we talk about the effects of global warming, it's both on the air, the atmosphere, and water, especially oceans, because ocean warming is one of the greatest problems here. And the sea level rise that's happening too. As the glaciers are melting, as the sea ice in the Arctic is melting, there are demonstrated rises in sea level, as we talked about in a small island state situation. But the other issue affecting the oceans is called ocean acidification. And this means that the pH balance of the waters in the ocean is changing from when the waters used to be cold and supported certain kinds of life to now where the ocean temperature in the upper oceans is significantly warmer than it ever was. And this is causing species to die off. It's causing a difference in the balance of the acidity of the ocean water itself. And one of the signs of that is the bleaching of coral reefs in places like Florida, Australia, etc. And this is a bad thing because the life cycle depends on many species that live through these habitat and depend on a healthy ecosystem. So the warming of the ocean water is a significant change that's going to alter the balance in our universe.
So my last question is, what are some improvements that people can make in their everyday lives to help lower greenhouse gas emissions and also help with water pollution?
Yes. What each of us can do about climate change is to reduce our carbon footprint. Use public transportation. If you're buying a car, look into electric cars. Eat less meat because growing cattle or sheep for human consumption contributes methane, which is another one of the greenhouse gases along with carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide. So reducing our personal patterns to avoid food waste and avoid water waste is a really important thing for each of us. And then the demand in our consumer choices when we purchase products that patterns of production also change throughout the supply chain so that elements of what we buy are recycled, that products are reused, that we reduce waste. Another aspect would be to fly less, visit our friends and family by Skype or WhatsApp. Each trip we take on an airplane, of course, is using a lot of it's causing the emission of a lot of carbon into the atmosphere. So what a state like California has done is to offer offset certificates, they're called. So if you do take a flight, see if you can buy one of these offset certificates from your airline or go online and search this out in California. The money is used then for reforestation because trees in a forest are carbon sinks. They can take harmful carbon out of the atmosphere. So that the importance of forests cannot be overemphasized and what we should do to protect them worldwide. And finally, each of us needs to participate as a citizen. We are part of civil society. Besides our personal habits, we also need to be active in our governments to make sure that our governments are living up to their commitments on the global level as well.
That sound like some great ideas. Thank you so much for taking the time out to talk about what's happening in Paris this week.
I want to just leave you with one last thought. I think some of you may have seen the photograph of some of the marches that have gone on around the planet. And one of the signs carried, I think, is memorable, so I just wanted to repeat the slogan. There is no Planet B. We all know about Plan B. In this case, for the ecological survival of our planet, there is no Planet B.
That was Dr. Catherine Tinker, founder and president of the Tinker Institute on International Law and Organizations. She is also an adjunct professor at the Seton Hall University School of Diplomacy and International Relations. And this is Emily Livaday for The Global Current.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of The Global Current. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. I'm Karina Taylor.
And I'm Chris Coleman.
We'll see you next week.
Global Current is brought to you by the School of Diplomacy and International Relations at Seton Hall University. Our executive producer is Alicia Sharabali. Our associate producer is Bill Gola. Our news editor is John Jadot, and our analysis editor is Blythe Brady. Our interview segment is produced by Emily Livaday. The Global Current theme song is Acid Jazz by Kevin MacLeod. You've been listening to The Global Current on WSOU 89.5 FM, Seton Hall's Pirate Radio.